It's customary before ordination to do a retreat, and it's also customary for that ordination retreat to be something of a trial for everybody concerned. Candidates tend to become filled with a sense of their own unworthiness, their doubts about their ability to endure. And certainly that was the experience of my own class. The retreat director's advice was to go into the chapel and to lie on the floor and to practice dying. During the ordination rite that we were preparing for, the candidate lies in the middle of the church, and the litany is sung. At the conclusion of the litany, the candidate rises and goes immediately to the bishop, who lays hands on him in silence. There is this symbolism of laying down your life. As the second reading says, pouring out your life like an oblation, and of arising a new person to a new identity. Now clearly he gave the same advice to everybody in my class, because entering the chapel at night was a health hazard. You would be tripping over bodies all over the place. And even though we had lived together for 7 years, it was still a little awkward. There is this very public statement when we physically act out our prayer. I mean, kneeling in a pew, nobody knows what you're thinking, if in fact you're thinking at all. But when you lie on the floor, you're making this unmistakable statement of doubt, of anguish, struggle. In those years together, we had competed against one another. You can't help but compete. We competed in the classroom, on the football field, socially. And perhaps our last gift to one another as a class was to step outside of that rivalry and to die, to lay our lives down together, and to become, through that, a new community, grounded now not in our accomplishments measured over and against one another, but rather in this shared vulnerability and truth and struggle. Today's parable has been used for centuries to establish who the Pharisees are, who are the arrogant, entitled boasters who parade their good works before the world and consider themselves a cut above everybody else. And of course, who by default are the good guys. We automatically pit the Pharisee against the tax collector as if they are rivals competing for the same title. And we can read into that a sort of game plan for ourselves. Uriah Heep-like. Humility becomes a means to the top. And read this way, the parable, of course, makes no sense. It doesn't change the paradigm. It just provides us with tactics for playing the same old game. And that is never the point of Jesus' teaching. And so at the risk of being hopelessly Jungian, could I suggest that we are both Pharisee and tax collector by turn? Our default mode is to assert our dominance and invincibility. We're expected to do that. We expect ourselves to appear complete and impregnable. We do it as individuals, we do it as a nation. Our legal system, like the culture that informs it, seems oddly adrift and disappointed when somebody actually admits they're guilty. it seems bad form to say guilty as charged. We're expected to launch into tirades of denial and accusations of a plot. We feel obliged to become defensive when something goes wrong. We don't even stop to consider how we may have contributed or even created the situation. Because like the Pharisee, we are grounded in rivalry. We measure ourselves almost from infancy against other people. And in that game, there will always be winners and losers, judged, that is, by criteria that have nothing to do with God. And this is where we become stuck, in cycles of aggression and revenge, endlessly repeating to ourselves our excuses, our defences, many of them no doubt legitimate, but without imagining that there may actually be an entirely different way of being and of relating and valuing, functioning. The original Greek actually describes the Pharisee as praying to himself. After a while, there's really nobody else listening. And as long as we go on babbling, there is no opportunity for silence, for reflection, for learning, and hence no opportunity for healing or peace. The tax collector is not the rival. He has stepped out of rivalry. For him, the Pharisee is utterly irrelevant. He doesn't exist. He is standing apart. His prayer is not over and against somebody else. It is before the God who accepts him and loves him, who knows the excuses without them even being offered. And so the Gospel describes him as standing far off, not lifting his head, not looking around him at who else is there, beating his breast and saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. This is the prayer of the chapel floor. And if you've done that, if you've had to do it, at some stage in your life, I suspect most of us have, then you know it's no game. It's no tactic. It's not the means to an end. It's just the end. This is the point when we become unstuck, if you like, where the evil that we have done and the evil that has been done to us become more or less irrelevant. When we hand it over to God and these things lose their venom, they lose their hold on us. We're no longer fixated with them, at least by degree. No longer measuring ourselves against someone else's opinion or judgment, but focused instead on the one reliable source of truth and of compassion. One of the advantages of working on site, as it were, is the opportunity to come in here during the week and to kneel at the altar rail or to sit next to the aumbrey and hand it over to God. To regain some semblance of peace and trust by just letting things go. We all need holy places. We need dedicated times to stand aside and bow our heads, and without reference to anything or anyone around us, in the simplest of words to say, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. We don't need that out of some sort of obligation, but simply for our own healing, for our peace. And Jesus offers this to his disciples not merely as a model for their own individual behaviour, but as the foundation for the community that he is calling into being. The church will not emerge, can never emerge, from a group of disciples who are in competition with one another, who are in rivalry for places of prominence and power. But only out of that group of disciples that has fallen to their knees before the risen Lord, who bears in his body the marks of their betrayal, and on his lips the words of absolution. A strange thing happened on the day before the last of my ordination retreat. I went down to the community cemetery that adjoined the monastery we were staying at. And somewhere in the middle I just sat down on a grave and soaked in the winter sun, and I began to wonder, had I ever met any of the priests who belonged to this religious order? And at first I thought not, but then I remembered that in fact I had been baptized by a priest of this order. He had been a great friend of my grandparents and my parents. He went to the missions, and in the isolation and loneliness of the outback, drank himself to death. Not long before he died, he called my mother and said that he had heard that one of the boys had gone into the seminary, and he was wondering if there was any chance that it was his little boy. And when my mother said it was, he said he could die happy. I realised he would be buried right here in this cemetery. And so without moving, I turned around to look at the names. And of course, of all the graves I could have sat on, I was sitting on his. He was a figure of failure and embarrassment to many, and to no one more than himself. And yet his was the mantle of priesthood that I inherited. Frayed at the edges, splattered with the mud of many falls. But, as the Gospel suggests, holy and distinguished in its own way. The work of our conversion is never done. It is lifelong. And at times, we seem to be only going backwards, becoming less patient, less tolerant, less flexible. There has only ever been one clear, transparent, pure embodiment of the gospel. Most of us cloud and distort it as much as we reveal. But there is this unimaginable truth that runs throughout the whole of the gospel, that God's way of constructing society and of evaluating our true worth is utterly unlike our own, that our freedom, our peace, our dignity, our identity doesn't lie in anything that you and I have accomplished, but in simply bowing our heads before the mystery of being loved in our contradictions and in our failures, finding our place among the frail and the fallen, which is always the company of Christ and of his saints, the church.